bulk of everyone for the past 2 years really has been the whole COVID crisis, the so-called pandemic. It's raised a lot of issues for people, and really sociology is front and center in a lot of ways, because as much as it is a medical crisis, it's really the social response that has sort of been the main characteristic of the challenges it's presented. How's your experience been with COVID, managing it?
Yeah, it's been a roller coaster, to be honest. At times very exciting and at times very mundane roller coaster. I remember when I first heard about the pandemic, I wasn't sure how seriously to take it. At the time, there were people who were saying it ought not be taken so seriously. That lasted for about a week. There are people that I pay attention to who are living in China. So I was reading their blogs and watching their videos and whatnot before people in Australia really started paying much attention. And after about a week or so, when it started to become a pressing issue here, it just made me realize how swiftly this news is spreading. I read about it on the internet one day. A few days later, they were talking about it in Australia, about it in England, and then suddenly Italy was in lockdown and completely silent, and it just swept around, and it led to this palpable sense of, I suppose, history taking place. It was the first time that I had felt that history had arrived on the shores of Australia in my lifetime.
I had quite a different experience because some senses I was caught up much more at the front. I was in the Philippines at the time, and the areas I was visiting had a lot of Chinese visitors. I mean, just mostly Chinese visitors at these places. And the actual place I was at, Jumageddon, was the first site of a international contracted case of COVID. And there was a couple who were infected, and one of them died. So it was the first death outside of China. So I was kind of already in that environment and trying to get out of that pretty soon after. And I remember, in the airports on the way back, they were already doing all the testing, and masks were compulsory, and we had to do health check, ask if we had fevers and any other symptoms of COVID. And the airport, by the time we got to Kuala Lumpur, was basically, there was no one there. It was almost surreal. So by the time I got back to Australia, I was already, it had already sunk in as the new reality that, that all these precautions would need to be taken. The thing that struck me straight away was, the thing that I guess I was interested in was how much of our communities would take the measures to, ensure that, or at least delay the spread of the virus. And some of the measures at the time being proposed, are ones that we've probably become very familiar with. Snap lockdowns, wearing of masks in public places. But some people have, I guess, conformed to those guidelines more than others. So it's a real issue of authority, isn't it? Or how much we're willing to follow the authorities.
Most definitely. There's different ways to persuade people to behave as you would want them to behave. Weber said there was different kinds of authority. There's legal authority, such as making it illegal to go out of your house and to socialize. There's also charismatic authority, which it seems, living in Australia in the 21st century, charismatic authority is well and truly behind us.
There's definitely rational legal authority that was front and centre here, wasn't it?
Yes, definitely.
The government, which holds the legal power and instructs the police to issue fines, which is the legal authority aspect. And then we had the medical authorities that are very much part of what we would call rational authority. In some ways we had some pushback, I would have thought, from some traditional authorities and also charismatic authorities too, if we're using Weber's typology, people on YouTube saying, what's the big deal? How dare they, make us tell us what to do, these authorities. I think there was a certain bit of that in the social media.
Most definitely. If we want to formulate charisma slightly different to how Weber did, the fact that somebody could put something really pithily, you will see people put out a tweet and it would be just a few sentences, and that it will be put in such a way that it seems very clever, very sharp, and it will be shared by 10,000 or 100,000 people.
We absolutely had that issue too with Donald Trump, with his use of social media throughout his presidency, in fact, but particularly during the heyday of the pandemic. And I guess Trump has both charismatic and legal authority, but I often look at his presidency as primarily being about charismatic authority in terms of how he got there and why people actually paid any attention to him. Maybe I'm just being a little cynical here, but I think many people would agree that he didn't get there on the basis of rational authority.
Yeah, well, if we look at the output, that seems to be what was going on for him. He was putting out, it wasn't competence necessarily that he was putting out, it was something else. In terms of who was receiving it, that's another context. You could have the shittiest rock band in the world, but the right audience at the right time.
It seems like he was speaking to the choir, though, in the sense that he was encouraging people at certain stages, at least, to not follow the authorities, even though he was getting advice from his own medical authorities. He in a way was saying, "Oh, masks aren't that important. This virus, we'll get on top of it quick. It's not a big deal." And a lot of people say that he's sort of underestimating the crisis was perhaps one of the reasons that he did eventually lose the election, particularly after he contracted COVID himself.
I certainly don't want this conversation to be dictated by Trump. Let's take a step back to the beginning of the...
Can I just say, though, that he was speaking to a group that, quite a large group of people who felt that the measures being recommended undermined their rights.
Yeah, I mean, there's if you go to university and you do an undergraduate degree, depending on what it's in, you will learn about the Enlightenment. There's an idea that the Enlightenment took place in different ways in different parts of the globe. So, for example, in America, the Enlightenment was primarily articulated in terms of liberty. And we're still seeing this now, which is quite different to, for example, in England, where it was articulated in terms of manners, politeness, this kind of a gentry scientific fellow, which is very, very different to the individual God-given rights, right? This was articulated in the pandemic because you had people who were basically living in a country, in a republic, where it wasn't to be taken for granted that the government could tell you what to do. At any given time, you could say, well, make a case. And when people aren't convinced by the case that's made, they will respond not passively but actively because it's seen as part of their fabric. We could see this as a larger expression of, and lots of people are talking about this, and sometimes I wonder if the manner in which I'm thinking about it is just a result from me hearing so many other people talk about it. And that is this decrease of trust in the public of our institutions. Don't trust the banks because they gave us the GFC. Don't trust the church because they're all sexual predators. Don't trust politicians because they're in bed with capitalists, and don't trust capitalists because they're responsible for the existential threat facing the planet. We can even see this now. You have the Olympics. People are saying, well, it's time that we retired the Olympics. Okay. The question is, once these great institutions are gone, what's going to replace it? Do we have the capacity to replace them? So you have this context which is provided where you have people who are already anarchist in a sense, insofar that they think that authority asserted upon them must justify itself in a way. On the one hand, that's coupled with a distrust of the medical establishment, of the intelligentsia, of universities, of all of these different places, and you have a perfect storm for a suboptimal response to a global pandemic, at least in America.
Absolutely. I mean, it does seem it was sort of part of the culture or the cultural fabric, so to speak, of one of the ideological drivers in the US. I mean, we don't have to look much further than the Constitution itself, which is almost viewed in this kind of quasi-religious light, almost like, you know, the scripture almost to many Americans. And the Second Amendment, which guarantees the right to bear arms, is explicitly concerned not with self-defense, but with resistance to government tyranny from their own government, not necessarily foreign governments. So there's always been this sense that in America, you need to protect yourself almost even from your own state, from the from overextension of its authority, which for many other countries, we kind of, I guess, we have an implicit notion as democracies, at least, that, you know, governments serve the people, but we don't really think in terms of, oh, what are we going to do when the day they try and take over and remove our rights? We have a concern with overextension in that, of our, you know, taking away our rights, but it's not to the point where we're going to build a, you know, basement and fill it with guns.
Yeah, a way to put it is the storming of the Capitol that we saw in January was always a possibility, a conceivable possibility in the United States, whereas I would say in Australia, the storming of Canberra is, I would go so far to say inconceivable. I think very few people think that it's a possibility. Let's get back to when COVID hit.
Okay.
Some of the sociological observations. So when the tension was palpable, I remember the first day that I sent my students at the university I was working at home, because one of the students had said, my housemate has just been exposed and we don't know what to do. I went into the classroom and I told everybody, go home. If you can drive. If you can avoid catching a bus or catching a train, you know, get home some other way, and don't see your friends and family until you hear back from us. And by us, when those words left my lips, I meant the university, because I was waiting for word from the university on how to follow this up. But since then, the us is not the university, it's the state. It took a little bit of time for these broad rules to be put in place. But before then, there was this brief period where people were trying to figure it out by themselves. And it was at that time that I think that we had this kind of germination of different responses. I remember the first lockdown, the tension was so much more palpable than the most recent one was. And the attitude was, well, this is fresh. We haven't experienced this before, at least people from my generation. I was preparing myself for, you know, a few weeks after we first heard of lockdown, we were seeing mass graves in New York City. So you have a generation of people, some of whom have never seen death beyond their aged family, who could potentially be exposed to as much death as the Spanish flu. And it was really like, oh my God, we are preparing for history. This will dispel the thick mist of second guessing. I thought that the material fact of a pandemic would help people to coalesce around a shared reality. But when that material factuality, mass deaths in Australia, did it occur, the mist descended heavier than ever. You are told that you're in crisis, and then you walk out the front door and you can feel it. You can see that everybody is stressed, but stress can only last for so long because there's this gravitational pull toward habit. So when the pandemic first hit, a lot of people I know, a lot of academics that I know, were calling it crisis. So an impetus for change, a disruption significant enough that society would switch from one track to another, headed in a different direction in terms of history. People were saying, well, community is more important than ever now. People were speaking to their neighbors. People are more concerned about grandma than ever. I mean, I saw people guilt-tripping one another about the morbidity of the senior citizens, and these are people that I know only visit their grandparents once or twice a year, and it's only when it's their parents encourage them to go. So there was this general upthrust in this particular kind of morality based around civil responsibility, mortality, community, and so on and so forth. And I was convinced at the time as well, for me, I was like, well, isn't this exciting? History has awoken from its slumber in Australia, and perhaps something's going to happen. And that was a sociological naivety, because for every disruption, for every change of track, there is the gross swaths of normality and habit in between, and it didn't take us long to return to it, it seems to me.
Well, yes, in many ways, and probably to many people's relief, we have been able to get back to a certain sort of normality, at least here in Australia, and probably helped by the fact that it never spread in the way that it did in most countries. The policy of containment was quite effective here. Right now we're having an issue with some states still having outbreaks, but by and large we've been pretty well off, and apart from these lockdowns we haven't really experienced the kinds of disruptions, I don't think, that some other countries have.
I just had a thought. We can tie this to some other thinkers. So there are two essays by the same name. What is Enlightenment? In German, I think it's something like Was ist Aufklärung? I can't pronounce it. The first one was by Kant, and he said, among other things, it's man's release from the self-incurred tutelage. So for a long time, the physician would tell you, well, perhaps you're going to die. Well, ask yourself, do you feel like you're about to die, or do you feel relatively healthy? The priest would tell you, you've done the wrong thing. Well, ask yourself, do you feel as if you've done the wrong thing? So it was this move away from a dependence on authority toward more of a liberal attitude of self-reflection. Exactly. And then hundreds of years later, I think like 200 years later, Michel Foucault, the French thinker, who didn't like being called a sociologist, came along and said, well, what was Kant doing there? Well, one thing that he was doing, among other things, was he was describing taking the temperature of the society at the time, of history at the time, and trying to come up with this macro story, what we would today call a narrative for what's going on. That seemed to be what's going on with the pandemic for 2 points. The first one is you could see it as this reinvigoration or this tension of tutelage. So there will be people saying, trust the medical authorities, trust science, which in many ways is another word for trust the state, depending on what country you're in. You will see researchers now saying, well, I have a PhD, and unless you have a PhD, you haven't done research, you don't even know what research is. So this call back towards tutelage. And then on the other hand, you have this attitude of, well, no, perhaps I can do my own research, I can observe the world to the best of my ability and figure out what's going on, right? So that's going on the one hand. On the other hand, there is this swing when people are saying, for example, the world is returning to normal, and then others are critiquing it by saying, but there was no normal, or the normal that we see before was an aberration. Why would we return to that normal? What that's an attempt to do is to pinpoint and describe a particular understanding of where we were, and say, well, here's an opportunity to say, well, perhaps that was mistaken, perhaps our diagnosis of it was completely off, and perhaps we can head somewhere else. So there's this tension between this attempt to put forward a historical narrative and to critique the former ones, and a move back towards, well, what would you have me do? Physician, priest, state.
Yeah, I think that's also, and Foucault is interesting to apply to that, but I think Marx is as well. Certainly the Marxist perspective is that a crisis is a good opportunity to revolutionize the system. Any cataclysm is an opportunity to kind of, pull down the structures that were there before and put up something new that's perhaps, going to be more fair and more egalitarian or whatever. But
it's critiquing the established social structures of the state is now seen as a right-wing affair. The left other people, and by the left I don't mean the revolutionary left, I don't mean anything along those lines. What I mean is the orthodox, the opposite of orthodox, the homogenizing left of such publications as The Guardian, the New York Times and whatnot, have treated questioning of the authorities of the state, of the established locus of power as right wing. It hasn't been a revolutionary questioning of
Oh,
establishment.
okay. So you're seeing it the other way, that you're sort of thinking that it's the right wing who are kind of saying, well, this is a new opportunity to change those structures?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I would have said it was the other way, because I think it depends too, in terms of what country we're talking about too, because
See my mind, I'm already thinking the United States.
okay, particularly in the United States, there's a sense that the government has already encroached too far, and that we need to sort of, proceed in a way that does away with these sort of structures of control. Whereas the leftist point of view is that the system has failed us, and we need to have a new normal, so to speak. So this concept, or this discourse, if you like, of the new normal, where you go, well, I just want life to go back to normal, and then they'll respond, but the old world was, what was so good about that, So yeah, I guess you can see it either way, couldn't you?
Well, yeah, this is where the language of the left and the right falls down. So 2 examples. For the left, they will critique the incompetence of their government for how they have responded, while simultaneously engaging in public shaming of people who don't fall in line with dictates of government. For the right, you'll have them saying, well, the government are doing their best. And these won't be the same 2 people saying these things. There will be people who look at the performance of the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison and still vote for him after all of this, while simultaneously refusing to wear a mask.
I think there's a lot of ambivalence here over what the government as a symbol represents. And for some people, it represents control and authority. And certainly, I guess a right-wing liberalist would view it that way, as government is kind of this other that has the potential to take away one's rights and one's freedoms. Yet from a leftist point of view, governments, particularly in Australia, for example, would be viewed as conservative and pro-capitalist, and propping up a conservative system that is holding society back. And during this whole period in Australia, for example, we've seen a lot of criticism of the government for being too slow to respond to sexual harassment issues and all those sort of issues that are coming out of the Me Too movement. The Black Lives Matter protests have also partly been critical of governments for inaction on reforming police services and so on. So the ambivalence of what an institution represents, I think, depends on how it's framed from a particular ideological perspective, and it will differ from group to group.
Exactly. You got it. If we think about it as a Venn diagram, right? We'll say the left on the left, the right on the right for convenience sake. In the middle is still what I'm describing, which is this gradual decline in trust in institutions. I was speaking to somebody today who gave me a lift home. She was talking about how she's friends with anti-vaxxers on Facebook. She's a public figure, previous member of parliament. And she was saying, well, she doesn't have to be friends with these people. She can unfriend them. And she's worried that what they're doing when they post on her wall, because she has such a large audience and network, is damaging. She's right. It is damaging when there are people who are engaging in the discouraging of public health for what we've seen as dubious reasons. But at the same time, if it weren't this, it likely would have been something else. If we weren't in a global pandemic right now, surely there wouldn't be so many anti-vaxxers, of course, but there would still be these people who are prone to a particular manner of thinking, which, if you wanted to be ungenerous about it, you could call conspiracy thinking, who are looking at our institutions and saying, I don't trust these people. I don't trust these clowns. And it's right. If you're living in the UK and you vote for the Tories, you still don't necessarily trust them. If you're living in Australia and vote for the Liberals, you don't necessarily trust them. the medical experts who are telling us how to behave have shown that in thinking about sociological matters, matters of supply and so on, they're not just engaging in their medical profession, they're engaging in social engineering, which is a dirty word nowadays, even though it may still be necessary. And when people hear that kind of stuff, of course they're going to think, well, how willing am I to put my well-being in these people's hands?
Let me tell you a story from my past week. So on the weekend I got some pain in my stomach on the right side. So I've had this issue before, but it seemed to be in a different area, and I was keen to get on top of it before it became really bad. Anyway, I went to the doctor's, and I saw the doctor on Monday evening, and the doctor had a feel around. He said, "Are you pain here? Yeah. Off to emergency. You're probably going to have a burst appendix." Okay, so this is, and we're first week semester here, so I've got my first classes coming up this week. So I saw the doctor Monday evening. I had my first class on Tuesday, second class on Wednesday. If I went to emergency, you know what it's like. You're there all night. You're in for the rest of the following day as well, because by the time they do the variety of tests, it's taken up most of the day. So I knew I'd be having to cancel all the classes. And anyway, I got home, all ready to go off to emergency, typed out an email to the students saying I was going to cancel all the classes for the week. And then I thought to myself, no, I won't. Why do I have to just automatically rush off to hospital? I know it sounds stupid, but I'm just going to wait and see what happens with the pain a little bit more, because I've had doctors give me the wrong diagnosis before. Anyway, I go back the next day to the doctor's, Tuesday night now. I'm not in any more severe pain, but it's still about basically the same. And I saw a different doctor, and I was hoping he could give me an objective second opinion. But he read the report from the night before, and he immediately said to me, "Why aren't you in an emergency hospital?" And I said, "Well, I was hoping that we could, do some more tests and work it out." He said, "Look, you've got to go to emergency because they're the experts. They have all the, the facilities there to do the proper check." And I said, "No." I said, let's have a little bit more of an examination of what's going on in terms of the symptoms. And he was taken aback. The notion that I would, say no for a start was, of course, absolute surprise. And then this kind of notion that, no, let's look into it and discuss it some more, you and me, almost like, let's talk about it together rather than you just tell me what to do. It was very surprising, and there was just this moment of silence, and then finally he, started feeling around and declared at the end of it that it definitely would not be appendicitis, and that it was probably a muscular issue, and I just needed to treat it with a bit of painkillers. And
did he seem relieved or disappointed?
He seemed, I can't really describe it, because in a way we had a discussion about what had happened, and he kind of said, "Oh, I was just testing you, at the start to see if I could trigger you," which was a very unusual thing for a doctor to say.
That's
but it was almost like he was trying to explain the advice he gave, which basically didn't turn out to be correct. I mean, in a way, I think he was probably. It'd be hard for a colleague of and these two doctors were colleagues, to actually outright question the other doctor's diagnosis. But I guess that was his first thought, was, "You've been properly diagnosed, why aren't you listening to the doctor?" It was a strange thing for him to say. I replied, "Well, I had to push back because I didn't feel any of the other symptoms of appendicitis, and I thought that it may well be something else, because I didn't feel that the doctor previously had done a thorough enough examination." Anyway, I think there's a fine line though between challenging that hierarchy between the doctors up here and the patients here, and sort of saying, no, let's have a proper discussion about it. There's certainly a difference with that from those who go, no, I'm not listening to doctors. I don't believe in modern medicine. I know my body much more than you. I feel that one is a kind of rational engagement that's more egalitarian, whereas the other one is just sort of resistance.
Yes.
And it's probably a fine line between the two. Jürgen Habermas has something really interesting to say. He's a neo-Marxist scholar, but he talks about this trend towards democratization. Now, Foucauldians might say that's just another meta-narrative, but Habermas says there is a process afoot where people are pushing back against what he calls technocracy and these technocratic authorities, doctors, all sorts of authorities that are based on expertise. And the notion of democratization is a much broader concept than just pushing back against authorities, but also a new way of engaging in politics and so on that is much more part of the civil public sphere, so to speak. But there is perhaps a sense in which people are increasingly doing their own diagnosis. They're looking at the symptoms, they're going online, doing their own research, looking at their symptoms and I guess Googling possible causes and treatments. There's a danger in that too, isn't it, if you don't have that kind of expertise in what you're reading. And I guess that's really the challenge, isn't it, that we see with people taking more agency in terms of, what's going into their body and how to treat different issues and so on, is that discerning between all the lots of rubbish out there amongst informed research and so on can be really difficult for someone who's not trained in these areas.
Or can't view academic journal articles for free.
I guess too, there's an issue of access as well. But even when, even the way these articles and that are written, the research is framed for experts who are familiar with the language. And I think even, studying for a lot of these roles, these experts, doctors, engineers, you name it, part of that is just becoming familiar with the language in which they talk to one another, yet alone building up the knowledge base.
Of course. I mean, there's so much to this. I if I were to read something in epidemiology, I likely wouldn't understand anything that I was reading. It's a one jump from that to saying simply trust the epidemiologist. Effectively, my point is, I'll link this to something that I've seen shared recently, which is, and these are other academics and other people who aren't academics, takes all kinds, sharing this tweet thread, which is somebody saying, please stop saying that you researched it. You didn't research it unless you have a PhD or unless you did all of these different things. You didn't research it. And the question is, do you want to discourage people from looking into something and getting informed themselves and then saying that they did so? Do we want to just fall into the cupped hands of experts who disagree on a national and an international stage with one another? Or do we want to keep this project going of saying, okay, well, for civility's sake, I'll do what's good for public health and good for my neighbours and good for myself, but at the same time, I'm not going to trust everything that my GP says, because the older you get, the more you will realise that GPs will spend more time, unless you're wealthy and you can have a really good GP, staring at the computer and looking at you. They'll prescribe you with things which, if you do a moment's research, you'll realise, well, perhaps I shouldn't be taking that. It's like, how many bad experiences does one need to have with the GP until they can start second guessing them, critiquing them, and pushing back a little bit. Because it certainly seems to be that there's a lot of people who are acting as though these idiosyncrasies aren't a part of the landscape.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying is sort of the ideal citizen, the rational approach, the almost Kantian, self-reflective person. I think that the problem, though, is some people will just grasp at whatever views support their own perspective already. So if someone is opposed to the medical establishment, they'll find someone's, YouTube so-called information that reinforces something that's, already agrees with their particular viewpoint.
I know, of course, there's a great deal of those people out there. But the response to it isn't to say, well, unless you have a PhD or unless you're a specialist.
No, I agree.
It's just the slingshotting in another direction. It's like, how pratty do we want to be and how we deal with this? With what you were getting at before, Jeremy, it seems like the underlying question is, how do we deal with this thin line between the ability of the individual to assert their own autonomy and to critique authorities and experts, and the actual value of expert knowledge and the dictates of authorities? My answer to that is just collaboration. Really, like if you go to the doctors and they just look at a form and then tell you, well, you need to cancel all of your obligations to other people and get to the hospital immediately, and they haven't even inspected you themselves, they're not collaborating with you.
No.
And you're not being truculent to say, well, could you please check me out and give me a second opinion.
It's been a great discussion, and I hope you've enjoyed it at home, and we'll see you again next time.